Okay, so this will be the last lecture on topic 12. Basically, picking up where we left off, I want to talk a little bit about pathogenic E. coli and a couple other things. As usual, please do send me an email or give me a call if you have any questions, and I hope this material. Let's talk about pathogenic E. coli. We talked a lot about E. coli this semester. I want to talk about some of these pathogenic strains and why they are actually pathogenic and some of them are not. So if you take a look at this, this is kind of like a Venn diagram talking about different strains of E. coli. Many fall into this category, non-pathogenic, meaning they don't make us sick. We have all sorts of strains. You can see geneticists love codes, K12, DH5 alpha, and so on. These are actually a number of laboratory strains that I'm familiar with. Some fall into the pathogenic category. You can see they also have acronyms: EPEC, enteropathogenic E. coli, EHEC, enterohemorrhagic E. coli, and so on. We'll talk about those shortly. And a bunch of E. coli fall into the potentially pathogenic category. So these are E. coli that are not usually pathogenic, but sometimes they end up in the wrong body part. So for example, UPEC is uropathogenic, that doesn't usually cause illness unless it gets into your urethra or urinary tract, and then can cause an infection. So here's another slide just talking about what types of infections E. coli can cause. We talked about the urinary tract infections, and the big ones, of course, are the gastrointestinal infections. E. coli is also very good at infecting other body parts if it can get there. So you can see all sorts of infections I have listed here, like wound infections or meningitis, or it can cause, there are rare cases of where people are actually getting a bacterial pneumonia caused by E. coli, and so on. But mostly we're talking about gastrointestinal and urinary tract infections for E. coli. There's what the acronyms stand for, so UPEC, urinary pathogenic, ETEC, enterotoxigenic, EPEC, enteropathogenic, EHEC, enterohemorrhagic E. coli. You don't need to know any of these acronyms for this course, but if you see those terms, you can see the EC is for E. coli, and it usually refers to some sort of pathogenic E. coli. They all have little differences in terms of what they're doing and what types of toxins they have. So the uropathogenic E. coli, urinary tract infections, sometimes this is called honeymooner's cystitis. Some women tend to get these urinary tract infections after they become sexually active, which is why it's called honeymooner's cystitis. It doesn't take a lot for fecal bacteria to transverse from the anus through the vagina towards the urethra, and sexual activity can contribute to this. As I mentioned before, these particular bacteria, not everyone has them. They have to have a certain pilus or adhesion in order to allow them to attach to bladder cells. Here's the enteropathogenic E. coli, all the acronyms. You can see there's a whole bunch of acronyms for them. If you take a look at the symptoms, the most common thing is that they're causing some sort of diarrhea. The diarrhea can be normal diarrhea or a bloody diarrhea. If you look at the descriptions, this is how they fall into the different categories. Often we're describing these things based on, what kind of virulence factors they have. If you look at the first one, ETEC. ETEC has two specific enterotoxins and has a very specific pili that allows it to cause not only infection but also the diarrhea that it's causing. Enteropathogenic, enteroinvasive, enterohemorrhagic. So enterohemorrhagic involves the O157 that we've been talking about. The biggest thing we're concerned about is this thing called a Shiga toxin, which is what causes the intense inflammatory response in the gut, which leads to a bloody diarrhea. So ETEC, that's enterotoxigenic E. coli. This is the one that usually causes traveler's diarrhea, passed in human feces. So you travel to certain parts of the world. Here's a map. You can see different parts of the world, particularly developing countries where the water sanitation is not at the same standards as you'd find it in Canada. You're likely to have human feces in the water, which can lead to traveler's diarrhea. So often people will travel to Mexico. Many people do Mexico vacations, and they say don't drink the water there because, of course, we're concerned about sanitation and traveler's diarrhea. There's also EPEC. This is a big issue for children in developing countries, and actually a pretty large cause of infant death in a lot of developing countries, and also passed in human feces. EHEC, this includes 0157, so you can see I have here 0157, E. coli 0157H7. This is the best known one that you see in the news all the time associated with contaminated foods. You can see over there on the right I have some spinach. Sometimes it's associated with cows, so there's the cow right there, and undercooked beef. And it turns out that many cows are carriers of this particular organism, and it doesn't make the cow sick. So there are many scenarios where this happens, where the cow feces, the manure, gets, you can imagine there's cases where romaine lettuce has been contaminated by this E. coli. Usually what happens is you have two farms side by side, a farm with a whole bunch of cattle, and there's excess rain or a flood causes excess manure to go and get into the romaine lettuce, and then that of course gets transmitted to humans. This one can be very serious, particularly if you're really young or really old or immunocompromised. Causes bloody diarrhea and can cause a very serious infection. This is the one we're concerned about that you hear about in the news, although infections in Canada are quite rare. Here's a little picture. You can see the E. coli here. Here it is. And what it's doing to this intestinal cell, it actually restructures this intestinal cell and produces these things here. These things here are called pedestals. They're kind of like big toilets. So E. coli is injecting toxins into those cells. It's going to steal nutrients and eventually kill those cells, which leads to the bloody diarrhea. E. coli 0157 became very famous way back in the year 2000 when the city of Walkerton, or town of Walkerton in Ontario, had a bunch of illness relating to 0157, and quite a few people got sick. I think it was like 1,500 people or something like that got sick, and several deaths from this. So it was called the Walkerton water tragedy. Since then, we've learned quite a bit more about 0157, partly due to this and other incidences, but this is one of the most serious 0157 outbreaks in Canada and possibly the world. This slide is just outlining some of the symptoms of this illness. It's talking about disease and is getting into the blood, and which leads to all sorts of issues such as sepsis and fever and all sorts of other things. You can see on the right it's talking about ground meat and water and sewage treatment and those kind of things, and prevent infection by cooking your meat and, of course, avoiding unpasteurized products and things like that. So this is part F, part of the mechanisms of pathogenicity. So we talked about how these things can become pathogenic. Part of it is, too, they have to get out of the body in order to infect another host. Generally, we're talking about the same as the portals of entry. So respiratory diseases often get expelled by coughing or mucus, as people are producing a lot more of it while they're ill. The exception is, of course, urine and feces, in that some organisms are not necessarily entering through the fecal route, but they're exiting that way and then entering the next person through the oral route. So we talk about the fecal-oral route as a method of transmission. So this almost wraps up the topic here. This is kind of a summary slide talking about the mechanisms of pathogenicity. Notice the key concept is that it takes quite a number of variables for an organism to be able to not only just cause infection, but also cause disease or some sort of pathogenesis just to the host. So know this, know these concepts, know examples from each. You will be tested on it for the final exam, so it's important that you do review this material and understand it. At least know examples from each of these things, because you will be tested on it in some manner. So besides those mechanisms of pathogenicity, of course, there are many other variables that are going to contribute to the ability for people to have disease. So gender, for example, inherited traits, different gene pools in the population, climate, weather, people who are fatigued, have a weaker immune system, diet, immunodeficiencies, age, lifestyle, chemotherapy, and quite a few other variables. The typical vulnerable populations, of course, are people that are very young or very old or immunocompromised. Of course, right now we're talking about this new coronavirus, and people over 60 are more susceptible to disease and more serious disease than younger individuals. People under 9 for this new virus seem to be having very few symptoms, if any. So very interesting. So topic 12 concepts, I'm not going to dwell on these. You can read them if you download the PowerPoints and the terminology. Please go over and understand all these concepts. Just taking a quick look at these study questions, and you can go over them, and I'll try to make sure I go over some of them or review them before the final exam. So this is the last slide. Send me any questions that you might have. I hope you're keeping healthy. Have a wonderful day.